Thank you for that wonderful introduction and welcome everyone to our series on machine learning. This will be a two-part series. I will be covering the fundamentals of machine learning in this session, and my colleague Sunil Amin will be doing a later session about how we apply some of these fundamentals to the more detailed security problems we see. So why are we all here? Well, artificial intelligence and machine learning are really big businesses. Here we see a capture of IDC, and for those that aren't familiar with IDC are a company that focus on market trends and analysis of where spending is going. And as you can see, IDC is predicting that worldwide spending on artificial intelligence will reach nearly $98 billion in the next 4 years. This is particularly significant because if you look at what we're spending today in 2019, it's just $37.5 billion. In other words, the amount of spending on AI will increase by nearly 2.5 times in the next 4 years, making it a really critical item for everybody to learn and understand just exactly what this technology is, and most importantly, how best to apply it to the problems and to the industries we're working in today. As you can see, if you look at Gartner's analysis of AI, we can see that it's an incredibly complex subject. Now, Gartner, for all these emerging technologies, produces what they call the Gartner hype cycle. Here we see the example for AI, and you can see it covers sort of the technology life cycle for any emerging technology. Most of these things, as we're very familiar with, are released, tend to pick up a lot of talk, a lot of hype, and Gartner calls this really the inflated expectations, when the hype and the expectation around the introduction of a new technology tends to exceed the reality of what it can deliver. And inevitably, this leads to what they call the trough of disillusionment, where reality sets in as more people deploy and utilize these technologies and finds the expectations they had are not being met. So where are we in machine learning? Well, we are right here. You can see that we've probably passed the peak of inflated expectation and we're moving on our way into this trough of disillusionment. And this is because there's been a lot of marketing, a lot of talk of machine learning, but very few people have actually sat down and looked at what machine learning is and isn't, what it's good for and what it's not. So in this session, we're really going to talk about machine learning and help address that problem. Because after all, what is machine learning? Now, machine learning has been traditionally defined as the field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And this definition dates back to 1959 and a research by the name of Arthur Samuel. He was looking at how we could get computers to really look at the game of checkers and understand how to play it. And for many of you, I'm sure this feels very, very familiar. After all, we remember IBM's experiments with chess and playing against Kasparov with their AI system called Deep Blue. And we've seen a lot of Google's efforts around playing the game Go with AlphaGo and defeating the Grandmasters. And just recently with some of their news headlines around the game StarCraft and their new AI for that named Alpha Star to play StarCraft 2. For those that aren't familiar with StarCraft 2, it is a pretty complex computer game released some time ago that is still being used due to its depth and balance and complexity. Google was actually having their AI and their machine play StarCraft 2 in secret against players. It's actually just reached the Grandmaster level, but it hasn't quite mastered the game to the point where it's innovating and creating new strategies and new tactics, similar to what it did and revolutionized really the Go playing field. So as we look at machine learning, it's important to understand it in context. Firstly, we have this concept of artificial intelligence. Machine learning itself is a component of AI. It does not cover everything, as we saw from Gartner's slide, but it is a key component of helping the AI learn without being programmed, as we said. And within machine learning, there are a series of learning algorithms. And these are really the heart of the machine learning. This is how the machine learns. So there are many different kinds of learning algorithms in the system. We only have a limited amount of time here, so we're going to talk about the three most common learning algorithms today. The first is known as supervised machine learning. The second is known as unsupervised learning. And finally, we'll be covering the third, which is reinforcement learning. All three of these differ in their approach, in the kind of data that they're looking for, an input and output, and fundamentally the kind of task or problem that they're trying to solve. So let's look at some of these learning algorithms in some more detail. And let's start with supervised learning. Supervised learning is a very common form of training. And it's common because of a couple of things. First of all, we know the question that we're trying to ask. Secondly, we actually know the answer we're looking for. So we understand what are we asking the machine to do, and we understand what the correct answer looks for. And because of that, we have training examples that we can teach the machine learning, teach the AI what is a correct answer. And from there, as a result of that, the machine learning can actually build a classifier that enables it to really start answering these questions. And you'll have seen some of these things in some of your common days. If you upload any photos or you're any form of social media user, sometimes you're uploading all the photos and maybe you're tagging people in them. And before too long, the website or the social media will say to you, hey, is this so-and-so in this other photo you just upload? It's a good example of understanding supervised learning. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So as we were saying, at the heart of supervised learning is training. In order to get an output from supervised learning, you need to take a number of examples. Remember, we know both the question and the answer, which allows us to build the training data set. From there, we feed it into the machine learning, which allows it to create a classifier, a way of understanding whether this is something or something else. Then, once we've trained the classifier with our training data, we can feed it new data and have it give us a prediction as to whether it matches the examples that were trained in the data. So remember, we understand the question, is this X? And we understand the answer. That way we're able to not only train the classifier, but also to understand if the classifier is giving us a correct amount, a correct value. If the classifier does make a mistake, then we can go back and continue to train and continue to tweak this in order that it gets us an accurate answer. So how might this work in practice? So one thing the internet has taught me is that we can never have too many pictures of cats, which is good because I have a very young daughter who loves cats. So as a result, most of my examples involve cats in some forms. So here we have a lot of training data, a lot of examples, photos, and pictures of cats. We feed them through our machine learning cloud to build a classifier. Once we've given enough training data into the machine learning in supervised learning mode, and the classifier has been trained up, we can then feed in new data, pictures that we don't know if they're a cat or not. In this case, we can clearly see what it is, but for the purposes of feeding it into the classifier, we wouldn't actually know. From there, we can get our prediction from our classifier. And as you can clearly see, it's a cat, which is fantastic because that's what we were hoping the machine learning would say. Now, what would happen if, having trained our classifier, we fed it a different image? And as you can see, this is not a cat. What would our classifier say? Well, a classifier would look at that, and assuming the training data has been sufficient and it understood the various forms of a cat, it would make a prediction and it would tell us that it's not a cat, which again is fantastic. Now, some of you may be asking, well, why wouldn't it know it's a dog? And the answer is we haven't trained it to understand what a dog is. If we had a training data set that included dogs, we could build a classifier that would also predict a dog. And that way we'd be able to, for example, to feed it a significant amount of pictures, both cats and dogs, and for it to be able to classify the difference between them. And this really is the most important part of supervised learning. The ground truth. If any of you are working around ML or are talking to people who are talking to you about how machine learning is working or supervised learning is working, it is the most important thing to understand what is this ground truth that they're using to train the supervised learning. At the end of the day, this is the thing that drives the classifiers, that is the heart of supervised learning. So you need to understand what is the example of the pair of question and answer that they're using in order to train the classifier. Because candidly, if that is wrong or if that is incomplete, it is highly likely that your classifiers will be either inefficient or potentially wrong, and that your machine learning cloud will actually not give you the answers you're looking for. So in order to have a successful application of supervised learning or machine learning, you really need to know what the training set is and effectively how that is being trained. And this is really, really critical for security in particular. We think about our examples. We simply can't afford to have the false positives or false negatives coming out of the machine learning cloud because the classifiers are incorrect. So super critical when you're dealing with people, when they're talking to you about machine learning, ask them questions, ask them what is your ground truth, and understand how they're training this. Now moving on to unsupervised learning, the second of our learning classifiers. This is very different to supervised learning. We used unsupervised learning when we don't have the answers, when we don't fully know the question, candidly, and we understand very little about the structure of the data going in. So in many ways, the opposite of supervised learning, where we understood what we were asking, we understood what the correct answer looked like, and we were able to build training data upon it by having the idea that we had a question, we knew the right answer to the question, and we simply gave the machine learning cloud enough examples of that until it was able to learn. Unsupervised learning is more feeding data that we don't really understand a lot about, and we really don't know what we're looking for, and sort of asking it what it can find. And the advantage of this is it's able to identify sort of previously unknown patterns. So it's able to take in and look at a lot of data and is able to really give us that view on a pattern which might not necessarily be immediately obvious to us. So here we're taking the example of unsupervised learning. As I said, unknown data set. Obviously this is an example, so it's pretty easy for us to look at it and understand it. But in the real world, this would be either larger or more complex or more opaque. We feed it in to our machine learning engine, and our machine learning engine is able to look at this and understand the patterns. And then it is able to actually identify things like clusters. So here we see a clear cluster of green, which might not have been as immediately apparent when we were simply feeding in, or when we had the data set and we were looking at the data set without the advantages of machine learning. Now, this ability to see patterns and to see clusters in data is really important when we consider the limitations we have as humans. Now, we can take data and we can plot particularly two-dimensional data and visualize it in graphical form fairly easily. And we can also take that data and we can extend that visualization to look at means and lines and to try and understand, the average pattern that's occurring in data sets. And, we can even take this visualization, this understanding of data and the relationship between data a little bit further, and we can plot it up into 3 dimensions, as you can see here, to really show more complex kind of data patterns and the relationships between that data. After this, however, it becomes extremely hard for any human really to understand and display the relationships between data and to identify these kind of patterns and clusters that may be significant. Particularly as we live in this era of big data, and anyone who's had or uses a SIEM, for example, will know this well. It is exceptionally hard to understand the relationship behind the vast quantities of data we're taking in. And understanding the significance of certain parts of this data and the relationship and the pattern between them is not immediately apparent. Where unsupervised learning can really benefit us is that it's not constrained by this idea of 2 or 3 dimensions. Unsupervised learning can actually look at data on a multi-dimensional capability. And in some ways it can take in data from with many different dimensions and actually reduce them down to 2 or 3 dimensions to really enable us as humans to understand the pattern, the cluster, the relationships, and above all the significance of some of these data sets. And that's really valuable. So we've talked a little about supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Now let's turn our attention to the third of our learning algorithms, reinforcement learning. Now this differs very much from the other 2. Here we're actually learning from trial and error. We're making changes and we're trying to determine what our optimal solution is by assessing how effective those changes are. Now to do this, we need to really understand the environment and where we're working in, and to be able to really model the states that might exist within that environment. Then we need to understand at each given state within that environment, what are our available actions? What can we do? And then finally, and most importantly, we need to have some concept of success. We need to understand what we are trying to achieve so that we can reward the machine when it gets closer to that success state. Now, how might this look in as an example? So let's go back to our original example from 1959 on checkers. So here we have our agent, our player, if you like, of checkers, in this case our machine learning, taking an action, moving a piece around the board, and where those pieces are and the moves that are available to him are well understood and well modeled. That, at the end of the day, changes the state. It changes the board. As we move a piece around, maybe we take an opponent's piece, that board has changed, and we're able to determine if it was a good thing, or if we're closer to the success. Have we, for example, reduced the number of pieces our opposition has? From there, we're able to go back and look and reassess what our next option is. We can model out all the different moves we could have made and see how effective it is. or if we decide that that was the optimum move that we could have made, we can then go back to the beginning and say, okay, now we understand our environment, our board with the pieces in the new positions. We can then go back to our player and say, okay, what are the available actions? What are the available moves we can make? And then model our way through each of those moves to understand, again, what is the optimal moves and how do we get closer to the end game, which is we have taken all of our opponent's pieces and won the game. So as we consider our examples from earlier of checkers and machine learning, we talked a little bit about Deep Blue and AlphaGo and some of these other AI machine learning inventions that have really caught the imagination with their ability to learn complex games. And some of you may have heard the term deep learning. So what is deep learning? Well, deep learning is inspired by our own brains, by the human brain. It takes inspiration in the form of taking multiple layers of neurons. And each individual neurons take a signal in and they send a signal out. And together they are capable of much more complex decisions. And as we know from our own brains, the accumulation of these neurons can really do extremely complex thinking and extremely complex problem solving. So this is the idea of an artificial neural network. And this artificial neural network consists of multiple layers, a layer that takes inputs in from the environment, one or many hidden layers, which are taking signals in from each layer of the neural network before each of the neurons in that neural network layer, processing them and then passing on signals till eventually we have an output layer that gives us our answer. And in many ways, this is building on the concepts we talked about earlier, where for example, we may use supervised learning, except we do it with an artificial neural network. So let's look at and understand a little bit more about what a neuron is. So as we said, a neuron takes in a lot of different inputs. Here we show 3, but there's no reason it couldn't be more or less. We assign weights. Weights are a way of thinking about the importance of the signal coming in. So some signals may be more or less important or significant, and by changing the weight, we can reflect that. The neuron then does a sum of these weighted inputs to understand what the information that's being passed to it before having an activation function. And that's usually a mathematical function that looks at these inputs to really understand, should I fire or not? And by fire, we mean, should we send a signal out to the next layer on the artificial neural network, or should we not? And that's really those inputs we see on the left-hand side in the neuron. Now, as we train the artificial neural network, we can go back and we can change the weights we've assigned to the inputs. So as we want to get to, if we're using supervised learning, we have a training set. So let's assume we have the example of, is this a cat photo? We can actually go back and change the weights to the input coming in to enable us to influence whether that activation function fires and the next layer of the neural network is triggered. And by using supervised learning in conjunction with the neural network, we're actually able to get to the answer we want. So as we've looked at this, we've covered supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, and deep learning. Now, how do all of these concepts work in security? So we have a huge landscape. We have a huge volume of data. There are many, many threats that emerge every day. There are many existing threats that still threaten us. And we have a huge amount of data being generated by the enterprise, as I talked about earlier. We only have to look in our seams briefly to understand that we have a tremendous amount of data coming in. And this is really exacerbated by the fact that we have very, very few people to look at this. If we need to sort through this data and start looking for the patterns that we associate with this threat landscape, the indications of compromise, and we need to correlate the different information together so that we can identify some of these more advanced persistent threats, it becomes a problem because the capacity of an individual remains fairly limited. And therefore we have a constraint on how much we can do as a result of that. So that's really where machine learning can help us. We can feed in huge data sets. We can train up these data sets. We can either build classifiers in supervised learning, or we can use unsupervised learning to see patterns or clusters where perhaps they weren't obvious before. And we can move towards automating some of this analysis, at least the more basic stuff, and correlation, to allow our humans to really scale more effectively. And that's critical because that improves our response time and improves the value add we're getting from our investment in people. People are in short supply and they're expensive. Let's make the best use we can of them by allowing machine learning to do some of the heavy lifting early on. Let's now talk about some of the examples of this in practice. We might be able to detect the kind of sneaky attacks that go on inside our network where they are using legitimate but stolen credentials. This is the age-old security problem of how do we know when Bob or Sally are not in fact Bob or Sally. And there is an excellent YouTube video on disrupting nation-state hackers. I believe it was done at Usenix in 2016. And it talks about how nation-state hackers exploit networks. And the real central message is that it's not zero-day bugs that allows these people in, or unknown hacks. It is the compromisation of credentials that allows them to move around inside the network, pretending to be someone else. So being able to see and spot and understand these kind of attacks is super critical. Furthermore, if we had the power of machine learning running, we might be able to actually predict the kind of bad neighborhood or the attack infrastructure that is being built before it actually launches the next attack. That would allow us to be far more proactive in responding and potentially blocking these kind of attacks being staged out of these areas before they're actually launched, or even worse, inside our network. And this really feeds into this idea that maybe we could detect attacks through the innovation and through the machine learning, because we're able to see the kind of patterns that are simply extremely difficult because of the complexity and the size of the data sets for our human analysts to spot. By running things like unsupervised learning, we're able to actually spot these clusters, these outliers, and be able to understand that something might be an attack pattern before we may have been able to spot it if we were relying on humans. And finally, we might be able to take this and apply it to some of the cloud behavior that's going on, and to actually uncover indications of these kind of compromises inside the cloud before they're able to exploit that and actually either use it as a launch pattern or an attack, or potentially to compromise data and exfiltrate it. And then finally, we live in an arms race era, the era of advanced persistent threats and very, very sophisticated malware. Machine learning really can complement our existing defenses, our existing humans, to be able to understand and spot patterns in this malware so that we can really identify these new threats, or identify when threats are effectively changed or rebuilt to avoid detection. Now, it's important to understand that although machine learning offers us significant advantages, we have to be careful, like all good technologies, There are strengths and weaknesses. And if you remember how I began this session, I talked very much about the trough of disillusionment and the hype that has been built up around machine learning. And as we deploy more of it, people will be more disappointed as their expectations have become unreasonably high. Now, it's key. We talked about the importance of ground truth and training data. Mistakes in machine learning can be far more costly. If we're just simply going to allow our machines to effectively learn and make a verdict with no review or input from a human, it's possible that we could have a false negative that never actually gets reviewed, so that our threat continues even though we may have put it in and have built a detection engine. Because maybe the training data set was incorrect, we don't see those false negatives. We don't see that threat. We get a false negative, and that threat is allowed to propagate inside our environment. Even worse, a false positive may result in some form of automated action that can interrupt key business operations. We don't want to get into a situation where we take off a CI/CD pipeline because our machine learning cloud mistakenly thinks that there is some form of sophisticated malware within it. It's also hard for machine learning to adapt to its environment, since it has no concept necessarily of what's around it. We always need to ensure that we're looking at our machine learning and understanding how it was trained, what its ground truth is. As that environment changes, as that environment evolves, we need to ensure that we are taking the time to look at our machine learning and making sure that it's aware of these changes. And how the environment around it is evolving. And then, most importantly, as a security professional, when we make a decision, when we make a verdict, we need to be able to understand and explain it. If we are in the situation where we decide that CI/CD pipeline is genuinely compromised, we need to be able to explain how we've arrived at that decision and how it's the right step for the enterprise or for the company to potentially take that pipeline offline in order to maintain information security. We cannot simply afford to say, well, the machine said we should, and we don't really understand why the machine said that. But we should do it anyway. That simply won't fly in the face of the business decision makers and the importance when it really matters in terms of money. Now, just as a final thought to leave you with, and I said at the beginning, this is going to be a two-part series, and my colleague Sunil Ahmed is going to talk about how we take some of these fundamentals and we build it together and we look at it from the perspective of security and application. I think it's really important as we think about bringing all these concepts together into a stack, if you like, that we can use, that we think about it like this. Let's not think about the data we're putting into the system. Let's start with the end in mind. We really need to think about how we're going to use machine learning to help us in our daily jobs as a security function. We need to augment or we need to automate so that we can basically have our humans, our expensive and sadly in short supply resources really used in the most effective way. So once we understand what the outcome we want to achieve from analytics or ML, we can then look and choose what the right analytical approach to achieve that outcome is. And that's where really some of these concepts around supervised learning or unsupervised learning and reinforcement, etc., can really be chosen in a way that supports the outcome we're trying to achieve. And then, and only then, once we understand that, can we then really look at the data and the training data, for example, that we might need. Where do we get it from? How do we ensure it's accurate? How much of it do we need? All of these kind of very critical questions are the end of the journey rather than the beginning. A lot of people will start with the data sets and where do I get the data and I have a seam, but with no clear idea of what outcome they want to achieve. It's really, really critical as we think of security analytics as a whole to start with the end outcome and then work our way backwards. And that really is the end of my session on fundamentals in machine learning. As a quick review of what we've done today, I hope that you will understand what is meant by machine learning and why it's called machine learning. I hope that you'll be comfortable with some of the common machine learning algorithms, whether it's supervised learning or unsupervised learning or reinforcement learning. I hope that you'll understand why and how machine learning can be useful in our security jobs, how it can help us scale the human resources we have in our environments to be more effective and to add greater value. And I hope that you'll be mindful of some of the limitations and restrictions around machine learning and security, and will be better aware and capable of having conversations around machine learning, whether it's with your colleagues or whether it's with your vendors. Above all, thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to me talk today. I know you're all very busy. I really do appreciate it, and I would be delighted to answer any questions you might have.